Welcome back to the last of the keynotes. As you may have noticed if you were watching the talk before this one, somebody managed to find a way to introduce our next speaker far better than I could, so I'm outsourcing.
John is actually the person who gave me the inspiration for the talk that I gave. And all the points that I made are points that he actually made way before I did. And he didn't just co-organize this entire thing, but he's a really good guy. He does a lot for the community in so many different ways. He's way smarter than me. And this is the person I would like to hear instead of me. And you get to hear him now. So there you go.
Thank you. So thanks to Sawyer for the lovely introduction, and I dispute that I'm smarter than you because I scheduled you in front of me, and that was bad. Bad idea. So, hi, I'm John.
Hi,
John. In my day job, I'm the Director of Technology for Infinity Interactive. But in my free time, in the Perl world, I maintain a few Perl modules. I moderate the Perl beginners and YAPC chat lists, and I was the speaker coordinator, as Sawyer mentioned, for this year's YAPC. So I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about YAPC and about our community and about getting old and ennui, and hopefully I'm going to tie that together in some sort of story that's going to be entertaining or enlightening, or perhaps maddening. So please don't hit me afterwards. I love Perl. It's my favorite language. It was my first language. It's the language I think in when I sit down to program a computer. But during the telling of this story, I'm going to express some opinions and I'm going to advocate for some positions. And I want to be clear, because of my position in the community and with this conference, these are my opinions. I'm speaking only for myself. I'm not speaking for my company. I'm not speaking for the other speaker organizers. This is all me. I also really love YAPC. This is my favorite conference. I look forward to coming to this conference every year. This is the best conference ever. I also really admire and respect all the people that are involved in putting this together and making it happen. So when I advocate for some of the things I'm going to advocate for, I don't mean to suggest that anybody is or has been doing anything wrong. I just think there are some things we could be doing better. So thank you for coming to my talk and listening to what I have to say. So part the first. YAPC is not dead, contrary to what you may have heard on the internet. So before I can talk about YAPC, I have to talk about how I came to be standing here. So last year in Austin, Peregrine asked me to do one of the keynotes. And I don't know how many of you have been in that situation, but when Peregrine asks you to do one of the keynotes for YAPC, you say yes. It's much like being asked if you're a god. You say yes. So I had no idea what I was going to talk about. And the good news, bad news situation was I had 12 months to think about it, which at first might seem like a good thing, but it turns out that actually it's just a really long time to procrastinate about thinking about different things you can talk about. So that's what I've spent the last year wondering about. Now, then a few months after Austin wrapped up, I was talking to Peregrine and asking him how preparations were going for this year, and he said, oh, it's going okay, I still need to round up a speaker coordinator. And I said, well, if there's anything I can do to help. And so this actually, I had ulterior motives. First, I got to set up the speaker schedule, so I got to basically design my perfect YAPC out of all the talks that were submitted. And that was a really special experience. It was great. It's one of the top 3 things I've done in Perl easily. Secondly, and much more selfishly, I got to schedule my own talk time, which meant that I could be the very last talk. And I also got to suggest that Sawyer give a talk, which again I was really stupid in the scheduling of. It turns out that there are a few disadvantages to being speaker coordinator, which are basically everything else involved with the job other than those two things. The biggest mistake that I made was my boss quitting. And me getting promoted into his job right when a lot of the organization was supposed to be happening. So that was not good. Try to avoid that. That really is Steven.
I don't believe you, he has hair! No beard!
It's gonna get worse. So now that we've had sort of the retrospective, a few notes from the speaker coordinator. We're not dead, like I said back beginning of the talk. Attendance is down a little bit this year, but that's partially because last year was a really, really big YAPC because cpan shut down, or for a day and sent everybody to YAPC. So we're okay, but I think we need to evolve a little bit to avoid becoming a dead end, to avoid sort of plateauing out. And I think we need to move in the direction of YAPC Asia. So this is a quote from a blog post by Miyagawa talking about YAPC Asia and how it's sort of evolved over the past couple of years to be sort of a small, completely Perl-focused conference to a much more general technical conference, still with a Perl core, but attracting a much wider audience of people. They have the problem now that it's too big and it sells out too fast. As a YAPC organizer, I'd like to experience that particular problem. Now, we need to stay true to our roots, right? We need to remain a Perl-centric conference. But we also need to welcome other communities, and we need to welcome other topics. Now, the YAPC community, as it stands right now, the people in this room, you're already not quite the Perl community, right? There are people that come to YAPC that aren't really Perl people anymore, right? Who in here doesn't consider themselves to be primarily a Perl programmer anymore? Right? So we're already here. We just need to get some more. And as the speaker coordinator this year, I tried to make some efforts in this direction, which some of you may have noticed. So one of them was, we had an entire track, or almost an entire track, of talks that were called Awesome and Not Perl. So we had an hour-long introduction to Rust. We had 30 minutes on roasting your own coffee. We had 30 minutes on brewing your own beer. All topics close to our hearts. It would be awesome to have more in this track next year, or even have 2 tracks devoted to this type of stuff that's of interest to people in the YAPC community, but it's not directly Perl related, including more active outreach to speakers outside of the YAPC community. And speaking of which, we had a special guest keynote speaker. And all props for this go to Peregrine. Peregrine put this whole deal together. So, pardon me. I think we're probably tapped out on Hugo Award-winning cpan authors. But I think if we can find people from outside our community that are, reasonably well known outside our community, but willing to come talk to us, that's a great way to attract attendees from outside that bubble. I don't think we got quite enough on the ball to advertise Charlie being here enough in advance to get anybody to come to this conference specifically to see him. Anybody, if you're here specifically to see Charlie, tell me I'm wrong. But it would be nice if we got someone who could attract people from outside the community. Finally, we crowdsourced the training selections this year. The execution of this was decidedly suboptimal, and that's all on me. But I still think it's a good idea. And the idea was to offer people a much, much wider variety of potential training, not so Perl-centric. Because for most people that are coming to this conference, they're not interested in a beginning Perl conference. They know Perl. They're not interested in a Moose course. They probably know Moose at this point. We've offered Moose courses for 5 years. I think if we could offer courses on other languages or on things like building your own flying drone, that might provide an incentive for people in the community for a long time to participate more in the training, which would be great. So all of these changes are in service of several overarching goals. And I want to emphasize, these are specifically about YAPC. This is not about Perl, the language, or Perl, the community. It's about the YAPC community. So one thing I definitely think we need to do, and I've said this already, we need to broaden our appeal. We need to attract newcomers. And we always have 1 or 2 talks during this conference where we ask who's here for the first time, and we clap and cheer, and that's great. But we also need to retain newcomers. So I know there's at least one, but who was at YAPC, or who was at Austin as their first YAPC and came back to this one? That's great. Does anybody remember how many first-time attendees we had in Austin? Because it was more than the 5% of you that just raised your hand. We really need to retain the people that come, and I don't think we're doing that great a job of that. We also need to re-engage people who have left the community who don't feel like they can justify coming back to see us again, to the Perl family reunion, as I've heard this meeting described. Piers Colley is a great example of this, right? He left for a while, he did Ruby, he came back to Perl, he gave some great talks about what life is like in the Ruby community, and I think that was very enlightening and informative and interesting to hear. Another good reason to get these people back is that way we can steal ideas directly from their brains. Not by eating them, because we're not zombies. And then finally, but certainly not least, we need to retain our current audience, right? I still want to see all you guys. I don't want to change YAPC in such a way that it makes people not come back, because I love this community, and I think it's great. So the overall philosophy here is that cool stuff beats out language advocacy, because language advocacy is really boring. I'd rather hear about cool stuff and weird things. Finally, long-term, overarching, my suggestion is that we think about reinventing or rebranding YAPC as yet another polyglot conference. Right? We're a polyglot community by design from the start. Perl was basically a little set, a little awk, a little shell, stirred together with a little Larry. Baked for a while. This is a strength, right? And the rest of the coding world is finally starting to catch up to us. There's a growth in conferences that are specifically, explicitly polyglot conferences. Open Source Bridge, Strange Loop, that conference. These are all conferences that invite multiple communities together to mix and exchange ideas. And YAPC has a perfect opportunity to join that, which, again, much like the rest of Perl, it's stuff that we've been doing all along and not really making that big a noise about. We need to make more noise about it and embrace it. Double down on our polyglot heritage. So finally, one more thing about YAPC. Organizing these conferences is a tremendous amount of work. And again, that's something that gets said a lot. And you think you know exactly what a lot of work means. I thought I knew what a lot of work meant because I had been involved in organizing some Perl workshops before I got involved in organizing YAPC. Unless you've done this, you have no idea how much work this entails. A lot of organizers, including myself, are effectively doing this on our work time. Our employers are kind enough and supportive enough of the community to allow us to do some of this during our normal working day and basically treat those hours as an in-kind donation back to the community. The head organizer position, however, basically is a full-time job for several months. So given that the mission of the TPF is to promote activities that are essential to the continuance of the language, and I think these conferences are essential to the continuance of the language, calling on the TPF to establish grants to fund YAPC head organizers. I really think it's time. Okay, so part 2, community maturity. So Perl's all grown up. We're 26, right? And typical for a 26-year-old, we're starting to realize that as you sort of start to age, a few things get a little different. To take a brief aside, Perl and my youngest daughter have the same birthday. This is how I remember Perl's birthday, not how I remember my daughter's birthday. Luckily, I didn't realize when she was born that she was being born on Perl's birthday, because that would have led to awkward naming conversations. Anyway, back to the talk. So typically in your mid-20s, you start to hit that I'm not in college anymore phase, right? You start to think about joining a gym. You have a stable job that requires you to go to bed at a particular time because you have to get up in the morning. And you start to realize that some of the stuff you used to do that you thought was so awesome is not actually that cool. And I think this is starting to happen in the Perl community, basically right on schedule. So as you may have seen from some of the promo materials for EPO here, there's a Mahatma Gandhi quote about being the change you want to see in the world. I kind of prefer my formulation, which is behave like you're a member of a community that you want to belong to. Or since they stuck Perl in the Gandhi quote, so I guess I should modify it to be behave like you're a member of the Perl community that you want to belong to, right? So my hope is that as the Perl community and the YAPC community sort of matures and mellows out and your knees start to hurt, my hope is that we can all take this to heart, regardless of whether you prefer the original or the extra crispy formulation. Because what the jerks and the trolls and all the other annoying people out there are doing is exactly this. They're acting like they belong to a community that allows them to be jerks and trolls and annoying people, right? And if we don't counteract that by acting like that's not actually okay, then we end up with lousy, horrible communities, which I don't think any of us want. Now, a lot of people wonder how to do this. You don't have to be confrontational. There's been a thread going on P5P on and off for a couple of years with reasonably well-known Perl people behaving in not reasonably well ways. David Golden recently started engaging on this thread and talking to people and asking them to sort of elucidate their points further in a way that he could understand and explaining them back. And most importantly, when he was snipped at, when he was insulted, he just ignored it. He just didn't even acknowledge it. And it was great. There was an actual little bit of conversation that happened. So I would, really like to call Dave out for doing that and say we really need more people to do that. You don't have to be insulted. You can just ignore it. If you get too insulted, you can just stop talking to someone. You don't have to insult them back. So another aside, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to present you an analogy. So if we can compare internet conversation to food, well, actually is the $2 slice place across from the dive bar in the college town. It's the one that's only open from midnight to 3 a.m. that serves giant, greasy $2 slices of pizza and features both kinds, sausage and pepperoni. So part of this move towards maturity that I'm talking about is realizing that the pizza from that place was not ever as good as you remember it as being, right? It was really bad for you. It did horrible things to your body. The same thing applies to well actually in internet conversations. It's not cool. It doesn't help. Just stop. If you can't think of anything better to contribute to a conversation, then well actually, just don't contribute. So another thing that starts to happen as you mature and get older is that you start to realize that legacy is not just an adjective you use to describe complicated code that you didn't write. Right? It's actually about the stuff that you're leaving behind for other people to deal with. So in Perl, one of our legacies is that a lot of our shared community stuff is kind of all over the place. It's not really centralized. It's sort of a patchwork. We started out before the web. We revere whip-upitude. And a lot of people just went out and did stuff because it seemed like it needed doing. And that was great, but then those things got to be important. And we still just have those people, those one or two people doing those things. So this sort of crazy patchwork arrangement where you've got a bunch of essential stuff not under any sort of centralized control is kind of an anti-pattern if you want to build reliable software on top of it. So I'm not going to point any fingers at any particular people because I don't think that would be very nice, but I am going to say if you're running something that is essential or that you think is essential for the Perl community and you, all by yourself, singular you, are running it,
Hands up. Keep going.
You and the single point of failure that you stare at in the mirror in the morning need to sit down and figure out what you can do to remove that single point of failure from this essential resource, right? That's part of your legacy. So instead of pointing fingers, let's talk about some projects that are doing legacy properly. Moose, right? Doing a lot of great stuff. They're bringing popular extensions back into the core Moose distribution in an active fashion. They've got commit and release bits set up for other essential modules. And they're distributing responsibility across the Moose cabal largely by having one person be responsible for it until they burn out. Currently that's Ether, right? But there are other people available if Ether decides to quit or wins the lottery. It's very important. Meta-cpan. Same sort of distribution of responsibility, doing a great job of lowering the bar for new contributors, actively trying to get new people involved via things such as the leaderboard, which lets you see how many patches have you gotten into Meta-cpan, right? That's great. I love that feedback. And then finally, another source of some maturity is irc.perl.org. I wanted to play a record scratch noise, but it was too much trouble. So did he really just say irc.perl.org, the biggest bastion of jerks in the Perl world, like the Mos Eisley cantina of online Perl correspondence? Yes, I did. So there are ongoing efforts, you've heard about some of them if you went to the right talks, to introduce community-based governance to irc.perl.org, to define standards of conduct for there, to set up a framework for enforcing it, and to expand the number of network operators to make the network clearly independent of any individual or organization, right? And that to me all adds up to a significant commitment to ensuring a positive legacy. Right? And Sungo deserves an enormous amount of appreciation for doing that. IRC.perl.org, just like the rest of the Patchwork legacy, didn't really set out to become the IRC hub for the community. It just kind of happened. So the network operators pushing for the community to regulate itself is exactly the type of maturity that I'm talking about. There's been a channel established at magnet-srb. Please join and help us out with this process. If you care about irc.perl.org, this is something you should be involved with. So part the third, community consistency. I've been throwing around the word community a lot, right? I've talked about the Perl community and the YAPC community and so forth and so on. And using that word is kind of a misnomer. We're not really a community. We're a bunch of different related communities, right? Mojo, Dancer, Pound Perl, P5P, all different communities, right? And that's great. There's more than one way to do community. We do have some unifying points. We're all Perl coders, or at least we're all interested in the language, and we have a lot of common interests, and we share a lot of infrastructure, irc.perl.org, the workshops and the running of them, mailing lists. And we also share the Perl Foundation, which funds a lot of this activity, wholly or in part. So there's more than one way to do community, but some community consistency is not a bad thing either, right? So I think it's important that this shared infrastructure come with some shared expectations around behavior. So let's talk about standards of conduct. This is our fourth YAPC with the same standard of conduct. I don't know who has read the irc.perl.org standard of conduct, but it's essentially the same document modulo some differences to account for the medium, right? So if we look at the YAPC standard of conduct, we have a number of expected behaviors that are basically a restatement of the reasonable person principle. We have the same thing in irc.perl. We have a list of what's considered to be unacceptable behaviors for YAPC, which are the exact same unacceptable behaviors we list on irc.perl.org. And finally, we have consequences, which differ, again, because the mediums of these standards are different. Real-world interaction and IRC interaction are not the same thing. The consequences are going to be different. So those sections are different, and that's fine, right? And so to be absolutely perfectly explicit, I think this is great. All of our communities, all of them, need to be welcome, inclusive, and have clearly defined expectations around behavior. Among the many reasons for this is to help retain existing community members, as well as not repelling potential new ones. I don't know if you've been paying attention to other programming language communities, but having a standard of conduct is not at all an unusual thing anymore. Not having one is, right? So we need to get on the right side of history here. So along those lines, I mentioned in my intro that I moderate Perl beginners and I moderate the YAPC chap lists, and I'm announcing right now that as soon as I get around to writing the document, both of these will be under an explicit standard of conduct modeled on the YAPC and the irc.perl.org standard of conduct. I'm also going to take this chance to urge that those people who have that amount of responsibility in other parts of the community, whether it be moderating a mailing list, running a shared blogging system, running a forum, and so on, follow suit in this effort. This is an important part of our community maturing and growing up. And finally, I'm going to call on the TPF to make a commitment not to fund events or projects that lack a standard of conduct similar to or compatible with existing Perl standards of conduct. Again, I think it's time for the TPF to take this step. This matches what other programming language communities are doing. Okay, part the fourth, community immigrants and expatriates. So, Chris, when was this? 2012? 2012, 2011. So I gave a talk down at Chris's conference, or actually here in Orlando at Chris's conference, OPW, the Orlando Perl Workshop, a few years back. You don't remember this talk because it was immediately preceded by Stephen Little declaring Perl dead. I told you the hair was going to get worse. Also note that Stephen was in on AC early. So actually that's not true. One person was evidently paying attention during this talk because Liz, a year or so later, gave a very nice talk using this title of the Perl Diaspora, talking about different versions of Perl and different implementations and different ways the language was evolving, which is a lovely concept and it was a great talk, but it wasn't at all what I meant. What I meant, and I've come to realize now that I've looked at it a little bit more, it was kind of an unfortunate word choice. Diaspora has fairly negative connotations. Really not the best word to have chosen. And it turns out that in science fiction fandom, there's a much more appropriate set of words that they've invented there that are acronyms, GAFIA and FAFIA. Those stand for getting away from it all and forced away from it all. So getting away from it all is when you just drift away from a community. Forced away from it all is when you don't want to leave, but you have a new job or a new family or some other event that pulls you away from the community. And they talk about gafiates and fafiating. And I think we've been having a lot of gafiating and fafiating from the Perl community over the past few years, or at least that's my impression. And this is fine, right? This is actually good. Closed societies are generally not healthy societies. they're not all that great about coming up with new ideas. So some exchange is nice, right? It would be good if we could get some new people coming in to replace the people going out, which again brings us back to the changes in YAPC programming that I talked about at the beginning, as well as the need for community standards. It would also be nice if we could get those expats to return, even if just for a conference, which is another reason why it's important to rebrand us as YAPC as more of a polyglot event, because it makes it easier for those people to justify to their employers why they want to come to this conference. Finally, we need to encourage people that are leaving, when they leave, to mention the good stuff in Perl in addition to the bad. I can't tell you how many times I've been at an event in another programming community or across programming communities where I run into someone who says, oh yeah, I used to do Perl, it was awful. There's all this legacy crap. And to be fair, I too have known the pain of maintaining janky legacy code bases after the original developers have quit. So, leaving aside the fact that this can happen in any language, and it can, and it does, there's rarely a mention of the good stuff in Perl. So in this talk, I want to single out one particularly good thing. And no, it's not cpan. Cpan was great, but honestly, other languages and their package management have caught up or even surpassed cpan in some cases. And that's okay. Yeah, I said it. What I want to talk about is the one thing that we have that nobody else does, and that's cpan testers. When I'm writing code in other languages or doing projects in other languages, I miss cpan testers so much. And nobody outside Perl, when I talk to them, has any idea about this great thing that our community has built that I hope we're all using. So if you're involved with cpan testers, is anybody here part of the cpan testers project? Anybody?
I organise all the funding for them. We need money!
So, if you're involved with cpan testers, it's actually good you're not at YAPC, because I hope that means you're at other conferences. You need to be at OSCON, you need to be at Open Source Bridge, or PyCon, or GopherCon, wherever. You need to be outside the Perl community talking about how great cpan testers is. Don't tell them it's written in Perl, right? Describe it as a distributed, fault-tolerant, self-organizing, volunteer-run, cross-platform, continuous integration platform. Because that's what it is. Mention volunteer-run and free to end users a lot, right, in your talk. Because one, setting this stuff up is a pain in the butt, if you've ever done it. And two, I don't want to shock anybody, sort of prepare yourselves. In other communities, people pay for this service. Like real money, lots of it. So if you just describe it in neutral terms, like maybe have a screenshot or two, maybe file the logos off, at the end of the talk when people are begging you, like, how do I use this wonderful free service to test my software? Then you tell them it's written in Perl, and then you drop the mic, and you walk off stage. Right? The fact that other language communities have not taken at least the idea of cpan testers and stolen it from us and implemented a version for themselves is criminal. So expats in the sound of my voice, if you're already established in other communities, you should be telling those communities about cpan testers and asking why you don't have something similar for your language. Okay, part 5, the other kind of community maturation. We're getting older. I don't know if you've noticed. So, quick age distribution. How many people under 18 do we have in the room? Katie left. 18 to 25? 25 to 35. Let's be kind and just say over 35. I don't know if you've seen any age distribution charts out of Silicon Valley recently, but we're significantly further right shifted than a lot of programming languages. Now, this isn't all bad. There are a few benefits of getting old. Primarily that you've already done the stupid things, and after a while you realize you don't want to do them anymore. But there are also bad things. One or two, anyway. And more than just the physical stuff, it can be hard to separate having a lot of experience and knowledge from weary cynicism sometimes, or even from an actual bored contempt or ennui. And I think we might maybe have a little bit of problem with this in the Perl community. So, one final digression. There's a poem I like a lot called Ulysses by Tennyson. Anybody familiar with this poem? Just the old people? So, this poem is about Ulysses, who's also called Odysseus, who is the hero of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are books you remember avoiding reading in high school, possibly. If you're not familiar with those, basically in modern terms, this guy invented the road trip. Right? The word Odyssey, in the sense of a long, epic voyage, is named after him. Okay, that's where that word comes from. So anyway, he's on the road for like 20 years. He's wandering the earth, having adventures like Caine and Kung Fu and shit. And then he finally makes it back home. And this poem is basically about how bored he is. Being back home, he's not on the road anymore. All he has to do is sit on his throne and rule his country, because he's the king. So the whole thing is kind of long poem, but it's good. But I'm only going to read you the end bit, which is the part that's relevant to my point. So the first part of the poem is basically him complaining about how bored he is, how there's nothing good to do. His son is ready to take over the king business, and he should just get out of the way because he's going to do a good job. And Ulysses is old and tired, so really what's he good for anyway? So now I'm going to read you this poem. Sawyer beat me to the poem reading, but old age hath yet his honor and his toll. Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks, the long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans around with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off and sitting will in order smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be that we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we know. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. So I like to read that poem to myself a few times a year when the I've seen this before and the there's nothing good anymore feelings start to get too strong. As a reminder, you don't have to stay where you are if it's boring. You can go somewhere else. So the final thing I'd like to advocate, actually I'd like to advocate you read all the way to the bottom of the slide. So the final thing I'd like to advocate, and I want to say this again, I say this from a place of love for Perl and for YAPC. If you're mature, or just mature in the Perl community, and you're bored and nothing good seems like it's ever going to happen before, and the damn kids are messing everything up with their nonsense and nobody understands, maybe you should consider going for a sail out west, checking out some other communities, and seeing if there's something out there that's not more exciting and interesting, right? If you do this, if you decide to gothiate from Perl for a while, that's okay. It really is. We all kind of have to do it from time to time. Don't forget to write. Send us a postcard. Tell the new people you meet about all the great stuff in Perl. And come back, all the great stuff in Perl in addition to the horrible old legacy code and zombies and Perl's going to abide. YAPC's going to abide. We'll be here for you if you leave, right? When you're ready to come back and tell us about all the cool new stuff you found, that'll be awesome. We'll put you in the Not Perl and Awesome track. So thank you for having listened to my story. The one bad part about being the last talk is that I have the least amount of time to talk to people afterwards before they leave. So if you have any feedback for me, I'd love to hear it. Safe travels home, everybody.